Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today I would like us to talk about the two examples of plays, our two examples of drama that I posted in this week's module. So I wanted you guys to read one of these and then watch the other. So hopefully this was all clear in the module. I posted the play called The Wolves by Sarah Delatte. This is a relatively recent play. It came out, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, so it's pretty contemporary, and we were just reading it. We did not watch it performed. We are just reading it. So we're really just analyzing the script, the actual text element of the play. We're not looking at those other dimensions that we talked about last week. So we'll cover The Wolves first, and then I also wanted you guys to just at least watch some of that theatrical performance of Hamlet. Obviously, a very famous play written by William Shakespeare. Some of you may have read it in a previous class. Some of you may have seen a film adaptation. There are several spanning a long time. Or you may have even seen a theatrical performance at some point in your lives. I realize it is 3 hours long, the video that I posted. So that's actually a video recording of a theatrical performance of Hamlet from the 1960s. So it's not exactly contemporary, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that old. I think it's relatively easy to follow. The sound quality is good. The picture quality is good. I do realize it's 3 hours long, the entire play. So I know a lot of us probably aren't going to have the time or the will to watch the entire thing. I'm not going to necessarily expect you to watch the entire thing. I just wanted you guys to watch at least some. It'd be nice to at least make it to intermission, the halfway point, just to get a feel for what the performance looks like, what it sounds like, so we can evaluate those other dimensions of drama. Remember last week we sort of broke plays down into 3 major elements or dimensions. We talked about the textual element, just sort of talking about the text, and we saw a lot of similarities there between the texts or the scripts of plays and a lot of what we were looking at with fiction, with short stories and novels. So the text is the first dimension, and then we also talked about transformation as the second dimension. That's just sort of a silly term, meaning the transition from written text to actual visual performance. As we know, all plays are written first, so initially we just have the textual element, and then that text gets turned into a performance. So it sort of has to get interpreted or transformed into a stage play, into a performance. So we talked about the importance of the director, how directors of plays are sort of similar to the directors of movies. Not quite the same, because plays and movies are not quite the same, but the jobs are similar. The responsibilities are similar. So the director is in charge of kind of figuring out the look of the play, along with, several other people working on the production. But the director will ultimately decide on sort of the set design, the look of the stage, also casting all of the actors in the roles, making decisions about costume, makeup, props, all of the visual elements, all the things that we see. That's all part of the transformation. Everything we see on stage, the actors, the objects, the way things are arranged, the way people move even. Those are all part of transformation. So we'll talk a little bit about spatial relationships, and we can talk a little bit about sort of how the stage is set up and what we see as we're watching. We can do that at least for Hamlet. And then finally, the third dimension is performance. And that's just referring to the performance of the actors. Obviously, they are making the parts on the page. They are making the words in the script. come to life through their acting. So that's obviously an important dimension as well. So with the wolves, we're just going to talk about the text. And then with Hamlet, we can talk about the text a little bit, even though we're not reading the play, we are hearing it. So we can still talk about some of the verbal or textual elements that most plays do have in common. And then with Hamlet, we can also explore transformation and performance. So let's start with the Wolves. I wanted to include one old play and one sort of contemporary present day play, just so we could have some variety. And I thought a contemporary text might be nice, particularly using it as the one that we read. So this text, the PDF that I posted in the week 7 module, it is pretty lengthy. We're looking at a little over 160 pages, but I think once you guys get moving, you'll see, and hopefully you've already read most of the play or at least gotten started by now, it's a pretty quick read. Just the nature of the play, the nature of the dialogue that we see between characters, it makes for a pretty quick reading experience. However, you do need to pay attention, because there's a lot going on with all of these different overlapping conversations. But because the language is contemporary, it might be sort of easier to relate to. We're listening to young people talk in roughly present day. I know some things change in 5 or 6 years, but this is a pretty contemporary play, so hopefully we find it interesting and pretty easy to get through. Now, Hamlet, on the other hand, is obviously much older and much more difficult to understand at times. I didn't feel like a week was enough time for us to read that play, so just watch as much of the theatrical performance as you can and just look for some of the elements, some of those things that we were talking about last week, but also just listen to the language a little bit. I know for a lot of us, Shakespeare is very difficult. Obviously, his language sounds old-fashioned to us. Sometimes we refer to it perhaps as Old English. It's not actually Old English, technically. We would not be able to understand it at all if that's what he was using. His period, the Elizabethan era, which was an important era in the history of drama, like we talked about last week, they're really using what we call early modern English. So it might surprise some of us to hear it described as modern at all, but early modern English does sound quite a bit different than the English we use today. But watching Shakespeare's plays can be a little bit easier than reading them, because when you are just stuck with the text, you have to make sense of that language all by yourself. When you're watching the play performed up on stage, you can use the actors, you can use the performance element of drama to sort of help clue you in. Even if you don't understand every word that the actors are saying, even if some of their lines don't really make sense to you, if you pay some attention and just sort of pay attention to facial expressions and physical movements in addition to the words the actors are saying, I think you'll be able to follow the action for the most part. And Hamlet's one of these famous texts where even if we haven't read it or even if we haven't watched it, we still know what it is, and typically we have at least some idea about the plot and what happens. So I want you guys to try to experience both plays. And, I know Hamlet's a little difficult, but if you watch for a few minutes, you'll kind of get into the rhythm of their language. Again, you might notice iambic pentameter oftentimes. That is the meter that Shakespeare often used to write his poetry and a lot of his plays as well. So you might be able to hear it. There is a rhythmic quality. The acting is good. I mean, that happens to be a really good performance featuring a lot of pretty famous actors, both stage and film actors. So it's a pretty good rendition of the play. I find it pretty easy to follow despite some of those language barriers. So again, even if you can't finish it, try to at least watch a few scenes, maybe the first act, maybe try to get to intermission, which comes at about the 1.5 hour point, about halfway through. All right, but let's start with the Wolves. We'll just cover text, and then we'll move on to Hamlet. So let's start by talking a little bit about dialogue. So obviously, with the wolves, we're just going to focus on the textual elements, and one of the most important ones, as we mentioned last week, for almost any play, one of the most important verbal or textual elements will be dialogue. That's mostly what we're going to see on the page. We're going to see dialogue between characters, conversations, words spoken by the characters, and we get a little bit of additional information as readers in the form of stage direction. So we see some of those in the play. Stage directions are just descriptions of movement, the physical movements of the actors. Who's leaving the stage, who's coming onto the stage, how are they moving around on the stage. So we get some of that, and we'll get some basic info, like if the characters are laughing, we might be told that they're laughing. We might sometimes get a feel for certain facial expressions or tones of voice. But like I said last week, we don't get a lot of description in drama, not compared to what we would see in fiction, certainly not compared to what we would see in a short story or a novel, and we're not seeing the same level of description with drama that we would see in poetry either. Just the nature of the form, the nature of this literary genre is such that we don't get as much description about what's going on in a scene. We don't always get as much physical description. Often we'll get a lot less physical description than we would in fiction. So that's just a different element that we can observe in drama. So in the absence of a lot of description and without a lot of narration, remember, we don't have a narrator like we would in fiction walking us through the story. We don't get a third-person narrator. We don't have an omniscient third-person narrator or a more personal, first-person narrator. We don't have a narrator at all. So we don't really get narration and the kinds of explanations that often come along with that. We don't get a lot of description. So instead, we have to rely largely on dialogue. The dialogue that's exchanged between these different characters, all the characters, of course, being players on this soccer team. This is an indoor soccer league team featuring young women, teen girls. So with the exception of maybe one character that we actually see and hear from, all the others here are players on the team. And we meet them on page 2 of the PDF. So the first page is just like a title page. And then page 2, we see some really important info. So most of the description that we do get is on page 2 when we're meeting all of the characters. When we see our cast, we also get brief descriptions of them, just enough to kind of give us an idea of their personalities. We get a little bit of an idea of what they look like. We learn their ages. I think they're all 16 or 17. So they're all peers, and for the most part, they've all been playing together for a number of years. So they're not quite all friends, as we see, but they all know each other. And there is one newcomer, one new player that's sort of trying to be accepted within the group. So we just hear them talking throughout the play. That's basically how all information is delivered to us as the readers. We get those descriptions up front, on page 2, and then we get a couple of other notes that are important for us to be able to understand the play. We learn some things about the plot, about the setting. So we get some information up front. We learn a little bit about where we are, and then it's just pretty much dialogue the rest of the way. So we talked about some other types of textual elements that we could see last week. So dialogue's obviously very prevalent in plays, but we also mentioned monologues, where characters are essentially talking to themselves, right? Having a conversation with oneself. So dialogue just means two or more people are talking, whereas monologue means just one person is talking. We don't really see monologues here. Maybe we see one toward the end. For the most part, we always see the characters operating as a group. We don't get isolated on individuals here in this play, which is interesting. We should talk more about that, with one exception. There's one brief scene where we see one character alone. But otherwise, we almost always see this group dynamic, which I think is very much part of like the theme, one of the big themes happening here. So a lot of dialogue, not really a lot of monologues, because we don't see characters off alone a lot, sort of reflecting or talking to themselves like Hamlet does a lot. So we do see monologues in Hamlet. We have a lot of famous soliloquies where Hamlet's basically just talking, to himself largely, but he's just ruminating, thinking about his problems and trying to sort of talk through them. Don't really see that here. Almost all dialogue, and like I said, almost everything we know comes through the dialogue. There is a plot here. Not a ton happens until near the end, when we have a very tragic event that gets revealed sort of indirectly. But again, it gets revealed largely through dialogue. What we learn about that event, what we learn about these characters, and what's happening over the course of the season, we learn it all through dialogue. But we also talked last week about the 3 Greek unities. Remember, a lot of conventions that we still have in drama were really set down by the ancient Greeks, who really kind of helped to create the drama tradition in the Western world. So one of the things that we kind of inherited from them is this idea that good plays should have these 3 unities: unity of action, unity of place, and unity of time. But we also pointed out that a lot of plays just don't follow those. A lot of Shakespeare's plays don't follow the unities. But here with The Wolves, I actually think our author is utilizing at least 2 of the 3 unities. If we start with time, we can see that we're not quite unified in time. Remember, the old notion with this is that the running time of the play ideally would sort of mirror the amount of time that is covered sort of in the plot. But that's not the case here. We're covering multiple weeks of the season. We know that this is winter time, and all of the action takes place on a series of Saturdays over the course of the season. So we start with week 1, and then we work our way up to like week 6, I think, by the end. We're not being comprehensive here with the plot. We're not covering everything that happens in those 6 weeks, but we are covering a decent amount of time. However, when it comes to place, we definitely see unity here. And one of the notes on page 2 tells us this. It's very important to remember. All of the action in this play takes place in the same location. We're on an indoor soccer field. And this is what we're watching, what we're looking at throughout each scene is like the pregame warm-up for this team as they get ready to play a game. So we only see them on Saturdays. We only see them during this like warm-up period before the game, and they're in the same place, and this place gets described for us early. So we need to remember, what it looks like. So we know that we're on an indoor soccer field with it's AstroTurf. We don't really see other people. We might sometimes hear other people like cheering or talking, but for the most part, all we can see is the field. The back wall appears to be like plexiglass, and we can see like fluorescent lights and fans, but otherwise, really just the field and the players on the field. So the place never changes. That's kind of a cool thing, I think, about this play. All the action takes place on that indoor soccer field during pregame warm-ups. And if we're thinking about action, the action is also pretty unified because as we learn on page 2 of the PDF, the warm-up, the different stretches that they're doing remain the same. The warm-up procedure, the warm-up routine for them is the same every Saturday. So they even tell us, the author tells us, that they're doing the same stretches for the same amount of time every day, every Saturday. So the action really doesn't change that much until arguably the end, where maybe things are a little bit different and some things out of the ordinary are happening because of that tragic event that I mentioned before. So we do get a little bit of different action near the end, but for the most part, the action, what we're actually seeing the actors do on stage, is largely the same, scene after scene. They're stretching, they're doing the same stretches for the same amount of time in the same place while talking. But of course, their conversations change and have different qualities over the course of the season. But we do see some unity here. Not so much in time, but at least in some ways we see unity in terms of very much with place. And then at least in some ways we see it with action as well. So we do see a plot here. Like I said, the plot isn't quite a traditional plot in some ways. It might not have all of those traditional stages that we would see on the old plot triangle, but we do get a little bit of exposition almost at the beginning. Just we learn about the characters and where we are. That's similar to the kind of information that we would get from a narrator perhaps at the beginning of a novel. So we do get that, not a ton of it, but we get some. And then we have a lot of rising action, a couple of different complications sort of enter into things as we learn more about these characters, these different players on the team. And then I would argue that if there is a climax here, it probably happens off stage. We kind of learn about it indirectly. A tragic thing happens to one of the players on the team. I don't want to give this away if you haven't finished the play yet, but if you're paying attention, it does require some attention, but you should be able to figure it out. There are some hints provided near the end of the play, and there's also a weird scene or a weird sort of moment in the final scene featuring the mom of the player who's had something very bad happen. And there's some ambiguity with that final scene, but we do kind of have a climax, and then we do have a resolution, at least to some extent, to wrap things up at the very end, although I think there's still some ambiguity about exactly what that final image is, involving the mom and the orange slices and what the girls do or do not see. So there are some unanswered questions, but we also see some form of resolution, things kind of getting tied up, some loose ends getting tied up, and maybe a slightly optimistic theme being sort of delivered or driven home. So we do see a plot here, but again, everything that we learn comes from the dialogue, and sometimes what they're talking about doesn't directly relate to the forward momentum of the plot. But that's kind of the whole point here. You know, the play largely exists so that we can listen to these characters. So again, before we move on to Hamlet, let's just talk a little bit more about dialogue. Yeah, obviously we see a lot of it. We know that. But just pay attention because, like I said, there is a lot of overlapping dialogue here. So what you'll notice as you read, it can be a little bit chaotic at times because we're not just listening to 2 or maybe 3 people talking. Those would typically be pretty clean, pretty easy to organize dialogue sessions. Here we have a group of like 8 or 9 people, often all sort of talking at once. So you'll notice, and this is very true to life. I think one of the reasons this play was popular, and it has been performed a lot, and it is pretty well regarded, is because it's very realistic in terms of the way that the author captures sort of speech patterns, particularly, you know, speech patterns of teenagers, because all of these characters are teenagers, as we know. But what you'll notice is within the larger conversation, you'll often have 2 people sort of branching off and having their own independent exchange. But then they'll often rejoin the larger conversation. And if you guys have ever been around, I'm sure most of us have experienced this. If you've been in a large group, whether it's friends or family or, you know, even classmates in certain school settings, you know that that's often how it works with a large group. There'll be multiple conversations going on at once. Maybe one big one that everybody's contributing to, but then people branch off, people get sidetracked, people start talking about other stuff, and sometimes that might derail the entire conversation. But then other times people kind of return to the main thread or the main theme of the conversation a little bit later on. So you just have to kind of navigate all of that, and also pay attention to the way the words are arranged on the page, because it's not always a simple conversation, between two people where I say something and you say something and then I say something back and we keep taking turns. People are talking over each other at times. At times people are talking simultaneously. Not everybody's always hearing everybody else. So there is a little bit of chaos at times with the dialogue. So just try to keep up and make sure you're reading everybody's lines as these conversations unfold. And again, we learn a lot about these characters, about their relationships, their backgrounds. We learn a lot from the conversations, but also pay attention to whose mom shows up pretty early on, about 50 to 60 pages into the play. Pay attention to whose mom shows up with orange slices. Again, we're only identifying these characters by their numbers. We don't actually learn their names. You should think about that and why that is. Why did the author choose to do it that way? But pay attention to whose mom shows up with orange slices, because that happens early in the play. And then the orange slices show up again at the end of the play. And if you pay attention to whose mom brought them the first time, you might be able to figure out sort of what happened, what tragedy happened to the team right before the last game in week 6 or whatever at the end of the play. So hopefully you guys can figure that out, because the plot does have a little punch there at the end, but you have to figure out what exactly has happened. Nobody comes right out and really says it. And again, we don't have a narrator to tell us, so we just have to go by what the characters say and pay attention to that mom character. She's the only non-player that we actually meet. We hear about coaches and other people, but otherwise all the other characters are these 8 or 9 players on this indoor soccer team. So again, in terms of characterization, a lot of what we see in a play will be similar to what we would see in a work of fiction. But again, the characters here are developed just through talking to one another. We don't get a narrator to explain things about them. We don't get to watch them, over a really long period of time. We're just seeing them in this one context, in this one place, over 6 weeks, one season. They're all high schoolers, but we do learn a lot about them, and their conversations are often very revealing. So there are a lot of team dynamics here that we need to be aware of. And again, think of the end. What is the resolution here? Do things get tied up? We hear them chant together. There's a sense that maybe they're coming together as a team in the face of all of this adversity. But what about that last image about that last thing that they see or don't see? There might be some ambiguity there that as readers we have to sort of, navigate and figure out. Okay, so hopefully that play was kind of fun, but we can only look at the text version. If you're able to watch it performed, you'll be able to tackle the other dimensions. But for now, let's move on to Hamlet and let's briefly cover text there. Because, we're going to see a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same features that we were just talking about. So clearly we have dialogue, we hear characters talking to one another. The dialogue is a little easier to follow in some ways because we don't have a big group where everybody's often talking. We usually have characters talking to one another. We might have slightly bigger groups, but the dialogue's usually pretty give and take, pretty typical. We also hear monologues from Hamlet. Of course, he has several famous soliloquies that he delivers throughout the play. But we might also see an aside. You remember I mentioned this as another type of sort of textual element that we can see on the page if we are reading the script of a play. So we get what is often in the scripts, often described or referred to as an aside at the beginning of the play, really when we first meet Hamlet. So if you notice in the beginning of the play, other people are talking. Hamlet's just kind of sitting there. Again, notice the way the stage is arranged. Notice his placement, his sort of physical presence. He's sitting there kind of moping. He's not talking at first. He's not really doing anything. He's just sitting there looking kind of sad. And the first thing we hear from him, a lot of people consider that to be an aside when Claudius sort of addresses him, his evil uncle, addresses Hamlet and asks him, how is it that the clouds still hang upon you or hang on you? Basically asking him, why are you so glum? This is after Hamlet's father's died, and his mom has married his uncle, so he's not really happy about that. But now his uncle is asking him, why are you so blue? Why are you still so down? And what Hamlet says next is often thought of as an aside. Like the first things we hear from him, the first two utterances, the first was really just one line that we hear from him. He's really addressing it to the audience, not really to Claudius. Then the next thing he says is to Claudius. Not sure, my lord. He's answering the question, but the first thing he says, he's directing it really more towards the audience. So see if you can catch that. Before he turns to kind of address Claudius and join the conversation, he's saying something, his first line, that's really not meant for the other characters. The other characters don't seem to hear it or be aware of it. It's really meant for the audience. And then he starts talking to Claudius and Gertrude. So we see asides, we see monologues, and obviously we see a lot of dialogue because, Hamlet's a longer play and it has more of these textual elements. When it comes to the three Greek unities, as we've already established, Shakespeare often dispensed with these. He often did not stick with these in a lot of his plays. And here, that's very much the case. We don't have unity of time because a fair amount of time elapses here. I don't know exactly, but a number of weeks or maybe potentially even months, but certainly it's not all in one day. It's not super self-contained. The action isn't super unified. I mean, all the action stems from one source, but there's a lot of moving parts here. A lot of different things happen. And unity of place, we don't really see that either, although that's the one he probably comes closest to because a lot of the action does take place in the castle. The castle of Elsinore, that's where we see a lot of our scenes, but not everything takes place inside the castle. We do get outside the castle at times. So Shakespeare doesn't really maintain any of those unities, but we are often in a similar place. We're often inside the castle, and a lot of the action is obviously related, and it's all kind of stemming from this central problem that Hamlet is trying to navigate, which is basically trying to figure out who killed his father and navigating this family drama involving his mom and his uncle, and uncovering the murderer of his father. There's also the ghost of his father who's kind of hanging around. So he kind of dispenses with the unities, but he does have a pretty traditional plot, a more traditional plot that we could track on that triangle. So even here in the performance, we actually see a little bit of exposition at the very beginning. So at the very beginning of the video, we see some text up on the screen giving us some basic information. 2 months have passed since the sudden death of the King of Denmark. So we're learning some basic facts about context, what's going on. Very similar to what we would see if we were reading, not just if we were reading a play, but also if we were reading, fiction. So we're getting some explanation, some background information up front. That's pretty much all exposition is, and exposition is that first stage of the plot. Then we have some rising action. We have an early complication, probably in the form of the ghost of Hamlet's father showing up and sort of alerting Hamlet that, some wrongdoing has occurred and kind of getting him on the case. We have a lot of other things that happen, a lot of relationships for Hamlet to sort of, ruin in various ways. And then we have a climax, a very bloody climax, probably the fencing scene where a lot of people end up dead, including Hamlet and Laertes and Gertrude and Claudius. A lot of poisoning and stabbing going on. But remember, the climax is the point of highest tension. It's the turning point. But it's not the end. Typically, we'll have a little bit of falling action, and then we'll have a resolution, which is the true conclusion that wraps everything up. So after Hamlet dies, we still have a little bit left. Fortinbras shows up. Horatio's still alive. He's talking. We still have to tie up some loose ends and wrap everything up. But we do see pretty much all of the major stages of the plot. We could argue that the event that kind of springs the whole plot into motion, the death of Hamlet's father, that occurs, before our action picks up. It occurs off stage, but we have a pretty traditional plot here. We got, we check all the boxes of the major stages, but Shakespeare often threw in some other elements as well. So one thing that he liked to do in a lot of his plays was to have a play within a play, where in the midst of the performance, the actors within the play are putting on a different play for some reason in the plot. Like it has to do with something in the plot of Shakespeare's play. So that's what we see here. There is a play put on in Hamlet. There's like this traveling troupe of actors. They happen to stop by, and then Hamlet sort of arranges to have them put on a play that in some ways mirrors what he thinks Claudius has done to his father. So the play within a play serves an important function within the plot, but it also kind of adds another sort of interesting element to that plot. And it's a little bit different than maybe some of the traditional plots that we could see. So, yeah, a lot of the same stuff here in terms of text that we can observe with the Wolves. Obviously, the dialogue sounds different. It's written in a very different way. It has a different rhythm and pattern, but we do see a lot of the same elements, although not all the same. Certainly Shakespeare's doing some different things. But now let's take a look at the transformation, sort of, thinking a little bit more about the performance itself. So I know we're not reading Hamlet, so we don't have the text to compare alongside the performance, but again, we're at least somewhat familiar with the story, and maybe some of us have watched it or read it before. So we know that there are a lot of choices being made here by the director of this play. So this is a play that was this was a performance of Hamlet that was put on in the mid-60s, I believe, 1964. It was a Broadway performance, so in New York City, and somebody just happened to film it. So I don't know who the director is. We don't need to worry too much about who the director is, but we can think a little bit about what the director did and some of the choices the director made. So we can think about the stage, what it looked like. Think a little bit about design and the arrangement of things on the stage. What do we actually see? You guys might notice that it's a pretty bare bones set. We don't really see a whole lot of props. We don't see a whole lot of like furniture or other objects. For the most part, we see the stage. We see kind of a raised platform that's a little bit to the back of the stage with, a few steps leading up to it. We'll often see a table, a few chairs, but often we don't see a whole lot else. Often characters are sitting on the steps. We don't always even have enough furniture for everybody on stage. We don't see a whole lot in the way of props. I mean, we see like goblets when they're drinking. Later in that climactic fencing scene, we do see swords when Hamlet and Laertes are having their sword fight. So we see a few props, but for the most part, we have kind of a sparse, spare set design. And that's just a choice that the director made. You can also think about things like costume. We're not looking at costumes that would be reminiscent of Shakespeare's time, the Elizabethan era. We're also not looking at costumes that would have fit into the medieval origin of this legend. Hamlet as a story, I forgot to mention this when we were talking about the plot, but Shakespeare is most likely adapting this. This is like an old Scandinavian folktale, like a legend from the Middle Ages. The character, I believe, was originally called Amleth, like a Scandinavian figure named Amleth, who again was a prince with a murdered father, and he's kind of playing dumb at times. He's pretending to be sort of dense or crazy, a little bit similar to maybe what we see with Hamlet. So this is a well-known legend. It was around for hundreds of years before Shakespeare wrote the play. And we even think there was an earlier version of Hamlet in the Elizabethan era, a little bit before Shakespeare came along, but that particular version no longer survives. It no longer exists, so Shakespeare's version is what we have now and what we remember. But he wasn't making this entire story up himself. He was obviously sort of adapting it. He was creating a new version of an old legend. I forgot why I was getting. Oh yeah, so really, the setting, the historical setting of Shakespeare's Hamlet is really the Middle Ages. It's supposed to be like the 10 or 1100s. But the clothes that we see, the costumes that we see in this particular performance, do not put us in mind of the Middle Ages or Shakespeare's time, which is like the early modern times. Instead, the clothes look kind of modern, not quite modern, not contemporary, perhaps in the way that like the wolves would be, but very formal. We see suits on the men, sort of big dresses on the women. I'm thinking like late 1800s, early 1900s. So the costume, that's a decision. What time period are we going to sort of evoke with our clothing choices? You can also think about lighting. What effects does the lighting have? Is it useful when it comes to emphasis or, creating a certain mood? Also remember something that we mentioned last week, the sort of spatial dimensions of the stage itself. This is also part of transformation. The stage itself, the theater itself. The spatial relationships between actors and the audience, how things are arranged, how the stage is situated. And we talked about how the design and the shape of theaters has actually changed throughout history. In ancient Greece, they had those big outdoor amphitheaters, and then later in Shakespeare's time, they had smaller indoor theaters. But the stages kind of had an L shape, or they kind of extended out into the audience a little bit and often had a second level so they could do balcony scenes like in Romeo and Juliet. But they didn't have a lot of design or props back then. With more modern theater that came along after Shakespeare, we have a different shape of the stage. We have what we call the modern proscenium shape, which is kind of box-like. And that's what the stage really looks like in that 1960s version of Hamlet. We often see a back wall, which often appears to be stone or brick. It looks like a castle wall in many scenes. And then we have what kind of appear to be two side walls. And then the front is open. So we talked about how this became the standard as theater kind of modernized and got more realistic. And we started to want to have a sense of almost looking at people inside their living room, almost like looking at the actors inside a house or inside whatever, building they were in. And we get that effect often here, because a lot of the scenes are inside in various rooms, but even when we're not inside, even when we're outside, like in the graveyard scene towards the end, we still get the same effect. We're in the front, right? The audience is in front. There's some kind of wall or backdrop in the back, and then we have the sense of there being walls on either side. So like we said, that fourth wall is the imaginary wall that separates the actors on stage from the audience in front of them. And when that fourth wall gets broken, that's when the actor directly addresses the audience. So you can think about asides, as sort of being examples of breaking the fourth wall. But like I said last week, we see this in movies too. When movie characters will turn and directly address the camera. That's like they're talking directly to the audience. That's breaking that imaginary fourth wall. So think about those spatial relationships and think about how the actors move on stage. Remember, in a play, it's a very different experience than watching a movie. You're in the room, you're seeing everything live. You can't pause, you can't rewind, you can't come back and rewatch a segment again later like you could with a movie. So obviously actors are communicating and capturing our attention largely through talking, through projecting their voice, delivering the dialogue, delivering monologues, but they're also capturing our attention by the way they move. Movement on stage matters in order to keep the audience sort of engaged and interested. So pay attention to how the actors move. Both while they're talking, in the middle of scenes. Also pay attention to how people come on and off the stage. All of that movement matters. That's all part of the larger sort of spatial relationship. And just notice also Shakespeare's a bit traditional in how he divides up the play. We do have 5 acts here, with each act consisting of multiple scenes. So that was sort of the ancient Greek model that was brought back in the Elizabethan period, having those 5 acts. Nowadays, most plays have sort of been trimmed down a bit, and we typically only see 3 acts. But in the case of the Wolves, we don't see any apparent acts, we just have a bunch of scenes. Each scene is a different Saturday. It's a new week as they warm up for the next game. So we don't necessarily always have to use the traditional act scene dividers, but clearly Shakespeare is, and he's sticking to that ancient Greek model. Now we typically use fewer acts. All right, and then that's pretty much it for transformation. The final dimension to discuss for Hamlet would, of course, be performance. But I don't have a whole lot to say about this. I'm no expert on acting, but obviously this is where drama is largely divided from other literary genres. When it comes to transformation and performance, we just don't see those dimensions. We don't see those elements in fiction or in poetry. So, but even with transformation, there are certain things that are at least closely related to the text. With performance, we're really just thinking more about the actors and how they perform, how they make these roles come to life. Obviously, they are interpreting the script, they are interpreting the text, putting their own spin on it, but the performance is probably the most removed of all elements from the original text, the original script. So we won't go through all the different actors in this particular version of Hamlet, but the most famous actor and obviously the most famous role here would be Richard Burton playing Hamlet. So Burton was a famous British actor from like the mid 20th century. He was pretty famous in the 1950s and 1960s. And this play came out in 64, this version that we're watching. So he was kind of a celebrity back then. Like he was married to Elizabeth Taylor for a while, and she was a very famous American actress. So they were often in the tabloids of the time. They had a very tumultuous marriage. They might have been married more than once. I don't remember. Burton had a lot of marriages. So he was often written about as kind of a character, but he was also a pretty celebrated actor. He's long been dead. but people of like my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation would have known who Richard Burton was. He was pretty famous back then, 50, 60 years ago. And his version of Hamlet was often thought to be quite good, but I would like you guys to evaluate it yourselves. Remember that Hamlet's really supposed to be a college student in the text. He's like home from college, and he has to attend to all of these things going on with his dad dying and his mom remarrying very quickly, marrying his uncle. But he's supposed to be pretty young, like college age, and still a little bit naive and green, but sort of becoming an adult, becoming the person that he's supposed to be, or at least trying to. He has some issues. So some people thought Burton was maybe a little old, frankly, for the role. He doesn't quite give off, college student vibes. But I think his Hamlet is pretty good. He's very moody. Hamlet's a little inconsistent at times, and we're not always sure when he's acting and when he's being sincere. So see what you think about Burton's performance, and you can also evaluate all the other major roles that we see. Again, these were a lot of pretty famous actors. So this would have been thought of as a good cast, a good collection of actors and good performances. But what do you think? I mean, you guys get to evaluate as audience members. So that's pretty much it, I think, for drama. Hopefully these examples helped a little bit, and we're feeling good about all three of the traditional literary genres. Now we've covered fiction, poetry, and drama. So we move on. Next week is the final week of Unit 1. So remember, Unit 1 is just the basics. We're covering sort of basic elements, basic terms, and some basic history of literature. Just covering a lot of, important stuff that we're going to need to know later. So now that we're finished with the three genres, we're going to spend next week talking a little bit about history, a little bit about historical literary periods, because of course literature has changed over time. So we'll try to shed some light on the history and the culture behind literature, at least in the Western world. Next week, we can't do it justice in 1 week, but I'll hit the highlights, and then that will be the end of Unit 1, and we'll get ready to move on to Unit 2 soon. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you next week.